Spongebob Squarepants is a wholesome kids show, but that doesn't mean there haven't been any controversies surrounding the franchise. In fact, there have been some rather infamous instances, such as Midlife Crustacean getting removed from streaming platforms, and that deleted scene from Just One Bite that was removed just after 9/11. But there's one episode of the show that has always kind of given me a weird vibe, but I haven't seen anyone else talk about this. So today, we're going to go over one episode where SpongeBob SquarePants, I think, inadvertently tried to normalize racism. Before we get into that though, first, let's talk about the diversity of the SpongeBob universe. I would argue that this show has one of the most diverse casts, as each of the main characters is a different species. We have crabs, sponges, squids, which are actually octopi, but I digress, and many more. However, the show does have a tendency to assign certain characteristics and personality traits to species as a whole rather than individuals. For example, in the episode Squidville, we see a whole bunch of squids that Squidward interacts with after moving to Tentacle Acres. And all of those random background squids are just as stuck up, stubborn, and no fun as Squidward is. In fact, it seems like most of them are even more lame than Squidward usually is, which is at least part of the reason why he chose to leave at the end of the episode. Of course, there's also Squilliam Fancyson, one of the only reoccurring squids on the show, and he is very similar to Squidward in a lot of ways, but he's just a more successful version. Like Squidward, he is self-centered, and for lack of a better term, he's just bougie. And basically every other random squid we meet on the show, such as Squilvia, seems to generally have at least some of these same characteristics. That being said, squids are not the only species that seems to have commonalities like this. We also know from the episodes that feature starfish, that aren't Patrick, that most, if not all, starfish are dumb. There aren't as many examples of this, but in episodes like I'm with Stupid, we are introduced to Patrick's parents, and also these two starfish who are so dumb they forgot they didn't have a son.
Oh, that's right, honey. We don't have a son.
Oh, yeah.
I think Janet and Marty are clearly somewhat smarter than Patrick, but that doesn't exactly make them geniuses. And Patrick's real parents don't seem that bright either, considering the fact that they were harassing Squidward, asking where Patrick was the whole episode. And of course, Patrick didn't recognize that Janet and Marty weren't his parents, but that's kind of expected from Patrick. In the episode Kraked Krabs, we learn that basically all crabs are cheap, greedy bastards. Throughout the entire show, we see this from Mr. Krabs, but until this episode came out, that was just part of his personality as far as we knew. But I think the fact that we see an entire convention full of crabs celebrating being cheap is evidence enough that most, if not all, crabs in the SpongeBob universe just happen to be like this. And interestingly enough, we get a little more evidence of this in the episode Ugh. There's that scene where Patrick is looking for things to eat and he lifts up a rock to find a bunch of prehistoric crabs scramble out from underneath it. And as I do so, they're saying, money, 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 money. Which is obviously a joke and a reference to Mr. Krabs, but it also suggests to me that crabs may just be predisposed to be obsessed with money if they are thinking about it even during a time where money doesn't really exist. In the episode Plankton's Army, we see Plankton invite his cousins over to help him steal the formula, and they are all, well, like this.
Hey, look, everybody. It's Cousin Plankton.
This is basically the only time we see Plankton on the show who aren't Sheldon, so this might not be enough evidence to make any conclusions, but it seems at least that most Plankton in the SpongeBob universe are basically hicks, hillbillies. Sheldon clearly isn't the same, but he appears to be the single exception among thousands of Plankton. That being said, I will also point out that there is one relatively major exception to this species-wide characteristic phenomena, and that would be with SpongeBob himself, or with sponges themselves, I guess. We don't see too many other sponges on the show, and most of them that we do meet are related to SpongeBob in some way, but none of them really seem to share that much in common with SpongeBob in terms of personality, except for perhaps Stanley S. Squarepants. But SpongeBob's parents, his grandma, cousin Blackjack, Uncle Sherm, among others, don't really seem to share that much in common with him. Granted, a lot of these characters we only meet once and don't really know that well, so perhaps we just need more information regarding sea sponges. And that is a pretty weird sentence out of context. Okay, so we've established that certain species on SpongeBob tend to be given certain characteristics as a group, but now it's time to talk about that episode I mentioned at the beginning of the video. You may have been able to guess based on the thumbnail, but I am, of course, talking about Squirrel Jokes. This is the episode where I think they took things just a little bit too far. So, you guys already know the plot of the episode, right? SpongeBob does stand up and starts flopping hard until he notices Sandy's giant teeth and decides to turn that into a joke. This devolves into him continuing to make jokes at Sandy's expense as the crowd at the Krusty Krab loves them. Naturally, the rest of Bikini Bottom then starts poking fun at Sandy when she's just trying to live her life. But the way the episode ends is where things get a little bit interesting, to say the least. SpongeBob tries some new jokes after Sandy tells him she is offended by the ones made at her expense, only for them to flop again, as the crowd is expecting more squirrel jokes at this point. And so, very quickly, SpongeBob reverts back to his old ways with another joke at Sandy's expense, and the crowd goes wild. But then he makes a self-deprecating joke about sea sponges, and the crowd, while less enthusiastic than before, does react positively. So then he makes a joke about crabs being cheap, and fish smelling bad, and starfish being dumb, as the episode closes out. This has had me wondering what exactly they were trying to teach us with this episode. Like, it kind of seems like the moral of the story is that making jokes at other people's expense is okay, as long as you also make jokes about yourself and everyone else. In other words, making a racist joke is okay as long as you are equally racist against all races, including your own, all at the same time. To clarify, this is not what I believe, but I can see how someone might learn this or get this impression from watching the episode. I'm not saying this is the message the writers were intending to convey, but I think that it is undeniable that there are at least some racist undertones in the way the plot of this episode is written. At the end of the day, I do believe the writers honestly intended for this episode to be a wholesome story teaching kids not to make fun of people, especially for characteristics that are out of their control, such as the size and shape of their teeth. I think the middle part of the episode where Sandy gets harassed by the Bikini Bottomites is intended to help teach us that our actions have consequences, sometimes ones that affect other people. I just can't help but feel, though, that they just didn't quite wrap the episode up in a way that truly conveys that message clearly. I think it would have been better if at the end of the episode, SpongeBob simply apologized to Sandy on stage, and instead of making more jokes at the expense of other people, including himself, he should have just come up with some different jokes that didn't suck. Basically, I'm saying that I think they could have gotten the same message across in a much better way that did not include racist undertones. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, that would really help me out, and if you want to know why I think Squidward is a better friend to SpongeBob than Patrick is, I'll leave that video on screen for you now. That being said, that is all for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, I'll catch you next time, and as always, never forget to be yourself.